brother could have been for the rest of the brothers that, I don't know where you hang out, Cape May or or what's the name, the island, some of those places. No, but he's right here with us. And I think that speaks a lot for this brother. And you don't have too many brothers like this, do you? No. Who is willing to come and be with us. This brother drove 2 hours to Boston before he got on the train. He's taking tomorrow off of his job just because he wants to be here with us. And these are the things that I want to point out. These are the things that when you find sisters and brothers making this kind of commitment, and this kind of dedication, and this kind of love, we have to respect them. And I think that we cannot be demonstrable enough when we say when we pledge our gratitude to this brother. Because I think yesterday one of the things he said, we don't speak the English language, you just express some of our feelings in the language. And this is exactly where I'm coming from. My brother, we deeply appreciate you coming here. So with that as a background, I'm going to ask you to welcome Dr. Edwin Bynum.
Well, first I want to thank African Echoes for inviting me here to speak tonight, and also to thank the elders, both male and female, who are with us tonight and sustain us. And I especially want to thank Brother Anunu for inviting me and for arranging me to be here. It was sort of complicated getting here today for lots of reasons that I won't go into, but I'm glad I did, and I hope that you find this talk tonight useful. It's kind of long, and I'm coming from the perspective of a clinician. Can everyone hear me? Okay. Coming from the perspective of a clinician. I'm by training a clinical psychologist. I've gone through a traditional training program. I went through Penn State University, got a PhD there, and then I went on to did a postdoctoral fellowship at a small hospital in Connecticut, and so on and so forth. And what I practice on a day-to-day basis, my bread and butter, is essentially hypnosis, family counseling, psychosomatic medicine. That's what I do on a day-to-day basis. But I also have a long and deep and perennial interest in the world's spiritual traditions, particularly those of Africa. I've studied at different times in the Caribbean, and I've gone to India a couple of times studying, and most recently I took half a year off, and part of that time I spent in Ile-Ife, West Africa, Nigeria, studying indigenous religious traditions. It was also important to know as I talk tonight about my background, where I'm coming from, philosophically and so forth, is that part of my spiritual practice, part of my sadhana, is in yoga. And yoga, some of the principles of yoga are associated with and underlie many different diverse spiritual traditions. Not only those in Africa, but also those in India, and as many of you know, there are very close historical and genetic links between the peoples of Africa and the peoples of India, particularly the Dravidian peoples. So in my work, I hope to bring together not only my professional, clinical, scientific, etc. training, but also my own personal blood interest in the African traditions, because I have a firm belief, strong belief, that science is not our enemy, but it is the way science has been used in various ways that has made it appear to be our enemy. But we have to remember that we were the first scientists. And so we have to we have to harness, again, this great force and bring it back to our own benefit and those of our people. So, that in mind, tonight I'd like to focus on some of the following. First, the origins of Homo sapiens sapiens, us, modern man, thinking man, and how this is basically an African phenomenon, and that it arose in Africa and then spread to other parts of the world. This is the scientific part of it. I'd also like to talk about the origins of the modern religions and the spiritual traditions of the West, particularly those in the three principal religions of the West. And I'd like to show that they are expressions and permutations of a deep, almost unfathomable African unconscious intuition of the way the world process works. The original early and later Western civilizations itself, as we'll focus on, are based upon an African template. These are all by way of introduction. These are all by way of setting the stage, because what I'd like to focus on mostly tonight, what my primary interest is this time around, is showing that the actual living biological and biogenetic force that is the root of religion and spiritual genius, a phenomenon usually referred to as Kundalini, a symbol of which many of you are carrying around your neck right now, is actually deeply interwoven in the human nervous system, and that human nervous system is based upon a certain kind of biochemical process, melanin and neuromelanin, that is intimately associated with the development of all peoples, but in particular African peoples, in the sense that we were the first peoples and are the template of all other peoples. Finally, I want to support the idea and the vision that human diversity and multiculturalism, as interesting and beautiful as they may be, and interesting, are merely surface permutations of a deep African primordial genesis. All the peoples in the world are variations of Africans, whether they like it or not. I also want to speak to the African template or model of both everyone's, all peoples, personal embryological or development in the womb, and how that reflects our individual and our collective spiritual development. Now, in order to do this, I'm going to have to get in a little detail in some areas, but I hope I can have your attention for doing that. And wherever I can, wherever I can think of it, I'll try to allude to the scientific and scholarly sources for which this comes from. So again, before I can do this, I have to set the stage with some scientific and historical and clinical material in order to make sense of some of the other stuff that comes later. I've gone to a number of different presentations and speakers, and while some of them are very exciting and very enthralling for me to hear, what I often feel is missing is what is this based upon in terms of what's currently scientifically, at least, if not acceptable, at least controversial. And so that's what I want to emphasize today, so that when I leave here today, in addition to a vision or an image being fleshed out, you also have a sense that this is firmly rooted in the present scientific enterprise. Again, science is not the enemy. Science is not the enemy. Now, archaeology, anthropology, paleontology, and most recently, population genetics and mitochondrial DNA studies have firmly fixed, there's no more debate about it, have firmly fixed Africa as the cradle of the hominid, that is the homogenesis, where we come from, the hominid line, and that Homo sapiens sapiens, all human beings are members of Homo sapiens sapiens. In other words, there are no different races, there's only one race, and the template of that race is sitting in this room today. And we have to keep repeating that, because it hasn't had the same kind of scientific and philosophical reverberations as it ought to have. It is the same import as when someone will say to you, or even a physicist will say to you, you know, all of this is light, all of this is made out of energy. And most people, yeah, I can dig it, that's okay, and they just go about their business. If you let that sink in, really, it will blow you away that all of this is literally light. That's a very, and not only is that a very far out scientific idea, but it is the core of many spiritual traditions. But we have to psychologically let it permeate also through that the African type is the prototype of all variations of the human beings today. Our saga begins, in terms of human development, about 12 million years ago in the so-called Miocene age, the age of the great apes, with a small little creature called Ramapithecus. She was about 3 to 4 feet high. She lived in the savannas and part of the time in the trees. She was a vegetarian, lived in families, and so on and so forth. Now, she's the common ancestor. She's the common ancestor of both the hominid line, where we descended from, and also the chimpanzee. So some people say, well, she wasn't a real progenitor of human beings. Okay, and that's based on some biomolecular evidence and so on and so forth, and that's debatable one way or the other, depends on your philosophical point of view. About 6 to 8 million years ago, the ape, chimpanzee, and the hominid line diverged. Development went in different directions. About 4.5 million years ago, roughly around in there, a hominid creature called Australopithecus ramidus. You may have heard about that kind of creature in Time, Newsweek, various magazines that study human origins. This creature appeared and roamed the highlands of north-central Ethiopia. She also was a vegetarian and a root gatherer, lived in families and small groups. About 4 million years ago, roughly, arose the Australopithecines. It's a whole group of creatures. In particular, Australopithecus africana. She stood upright, and that's very important, because before this time we were closer to walking on all fours. She stood up almost upright, was about 4 feet tall, brain case a little larger, and this is very important. All other hominid lines came through her. All other hominid lines came through her. Now later, there was a lush profusion of other different Australopithecine kind of creatures running around. Australopithecus africanus, Australopithecus bosi, Australopithecus robustus, which means it was a very strong one. Australopithecus gracile is a very gentle one. This refers to body type. Australopithecus ethiopia. So you get the sense that there were a lot of different types competing at that time for who was going to move into where you are, or where we are today. About 2.5 million years ago, more sophisticated hominids broke away from the Australopithecines and developed into what's called Homo habilis, the tool user. And that's a very important development. The hominid line started being able to use tools, started being able to think, to take something and do something else with it that it was not done before. Other offshoots were around at that time, but they died out, and we really don't know why they died out. People speculate about climactic changes and so on and so forth, but we really don't know. Boskop man, the creature, he died out. His brain case was bigger than our brain case today. So it isn't about the size of the skull, and it may not be about the size of the brain. Okay? The general opinion today is it's more about the convolutions of the brain. Maybe, but there's also some indication that it's not only the convolutions of the brain, but also what the brain surface is composed of. There are also a lot of others. Homo rudolphus, who was there, died out. And lots of others that we don't even know about yet. The bones haven't been unearthed. A good source for this is Richard Leakey's book, Origins, and Johansen and Eddy's book, Lucy, the Beginnings of Human Evolution. Now, about 2 to 2.5 million years ago, this Homo habilis, the tool maker, is roaming around, and he dominates the area for about 1 million years, roughly 1 million years, until he either mutates into another form, or he dies out or transforms. We don't really know. But 1.5 million years ago, the only hominid type around was one called Homo erectus, the man who stood up. First time human beings or human types are standing up completely tall. And very importantly, he was the first hominid to travel out of Africa. Before this time, all the hominids are developing in Africa. They're not anywhere else. So that means the physical structure, the genetic structure, all the basic structures of what you think of as a human being, all of these developed within an African context. Homo erectus traveled out of Africa, and he's found all over the world, many places in the world, I should say. Of course, 1,700,000 years ago in East Africa, where she rose. 700,000 years ago in China, bones are found. 700,000 years ago in Algeria. 500,000 years ago in Narma, India. Remember, fire is first domesticated in Africa. Crops are first domesticated in Africa. But the oldest bones of our kind are clearly found in Africa, and the highest numbers of them. So it's pretty conclusive that this is the home of human beings. There's no polygenesis. Human beings didn't develop in all different kinds of places and move. They developed in one place and moved out. Okay. What about Homo sapiens sapiens? That's us, Homo sapiens sapiens, thinking man. Well, she first developed in Africa also. Her bones have been found in different parts of the world. Parts of the world later, Australia 50,000 years ago, Philippines 30,000 years ago, Middle East 92,000 years ago, Siberia 30,000, China 67,000, Europe 33,000, but her earliest remains were found in Africa. Now, at this time, say maybe 50 to 30,000 years ago, human beings are scattered all over the planet. Okay, we've gotten to all the places on the planet except Antarctica. We've even reached the Americas by this time. Homo sapiens sapiens throughout the world at this time share certain characteristics. We're about 4 to 5 feet high, stand upright, use tools and fire, and very, very, very importantly, all are very dark-skinned or black. All. These are the ones in Europe, in Asia, in South America. All are black. And this is because of a simple, it's not so simple, but it is a well-established evolutionary law. It's called Glosser's Law. And it states that all mammals reared in a near the equator, that is a hot and humid climate, must have dark skin for adaptation to the sun's ultraviolet rays. It is merely adaptational. So, we have 50,000 years ago, all over the planet, one race, and that race is black. Thus, all stages of Homo sapiens sapiens in this room today arise in Africa. All human stock is Africoid in its origin. And this is the result of computer analysis. We have our mitochondrial DNA computer studies, and we also have now the cross-mapping of human gene pool. There's a new book out, over 1,000 pages long with graphs and so forth. Meticulous analysis of the gene pools, cross-fertilizing of all the peoples of the earth. It's the History and Geography of Human Genes by Calvelli, Sephora, Mendoza, Piazzi. Came out last year, Princeton University. It is definitive. It's quite clear. So we're all one species. This is the prototype. This is the template. And racial diversification is a relatively new phenomenon. Human beings have been around for at least 200,000 years in our present form, and maybe 500,000. And only in the last 25 to 30,000 years has there been different types of human beings. I want you to please note something. That the Neanderthal man was not a Homo sapiens sapiens. He was a Homo sapien. He was not a complete man from our point of view. He had a lobe missing in the brain, so certain information he could not process. But he survived from 300,000 years ago to about 50,000 years ago. And he died out. Why he died out? No one really knows. But he died out. He traveled out of where he was born. And he may have generated in Africa. It's unknown. He may have generated in Europe. It's unknown. His bones are found everywhere. But one thing is interesting about him, or many things are interesting about him, is that he oftentimes buried his dead. And that indicates that he had some rudimentary religious or spiritual intuition. So religion and spirituality are older than necessarily the Homo sapiens sapiens. So we don't invent religion and spirituality. We uncover it. We discover it. It's already there. It's not a matter of constructing it. But Neanderthal was an evolutionary dead end. Nobody in this room has Neanderthal genes or Neanderthal blood in them. Really. This notion of an afterlife, I want to emphasize that, this notion of an afterlife and a rudimentary spiritual consciousness grows slowly in human experience over hundreds and hundreds and hundreds of millennia. But it only takes a quantum leap thousands and thousands of years ago in Africa, and this is associated with the cult of Osiris. There's a quantum leap in spiritual consciousness of human beings that is associated with the Osirian cult, and we're going to talk about that a little bit later. But I wanted to just drop that right now. So, very brief background, setting the stage here. All the hominid lines that lead to modern humanity, Homo Sapiens sapiens, arose in Africa and were of necessity dark brown to black in skin tone. Partial lines of Homo sapiens sapiens are found in different parts of the world, but the complete skeleton and the complete formations are only found in Africa, and they're found earlier in Africa than anywhere else. Not only was the first human being an African, but the entire sequence, not just the first man, but the last man, the present form, developed in an African context. All humanity today is rooted in an African template, and there are only mutations of this form. There's no speciations. There are only mutations. Periodically you'll find someone who will bring up that argument again, and it's just bogus. It's just been ruled out by DNA and genetic analysis. The Africoid type is the root and parent stock in which there are surface variations and phenotypical mutations and adaptations to various ecological and climatic changes. So, most of humanity's 3.5 to 4 million years, however far back you want to take it, 3.5 to 4 million year history as a hominid has been spent in an African cradle of unfoldment. Only about 12% of this has partially been out of Africa. This means literally billions and perhaps trillions of hours of conscious human experience has been in the African context. This leads to what I feel is an African template, the African basis for the generation and the speciation of the human being. This is the case for us morphologically, anthropologically, genetically, historically, and in deep psychic and spiritual ways also. See, the collective unconscious, we hear so much about, is at bottom the African unconscious. And this is the case also not only for African people, this is the case for European people, and this is the case for people in Asia, Japan, South America, and everywhere. The deepest levels of their minds also is an African structure, an African basis to the generation of their own consciousness. This is what's called in psychiatry and psychology the real threatened return of the repressed. Most nations, most cultures fear the darkness, and that's part of why that fear is, because it's the fear of one's own origin, the threatened return of the repressed. I want to talk a little bit about embryogenesis here, because it's important, it's germane to what we're going to talk about next, what I'm going to build on. Embryogenesis is just a complicated word for what goes on with the fetus during development. Embryogenesis. Going from a tiny, tiny fetus to an organized human being. Okay. Embryogenesis from the first hours is guided and organized, this is very importantly, by a very important molecule known as melanin. Okay. There are numerous references for this, but the best medical reference is F.E. Barr in Medical Hypotheses. Melanin, the organizing molecule, came out in 1983. But there are a number of others. What you have is the egg and the sperm unite, fertilize, you have a zygote. It goes into the zygote continues to develop into several stages. And it has 3 levels as it develops. Okay? These 3 levels are the endoderm, and that leads to the development of the GI tract, liver, thyroid, pancreas, and so forth. A mesoderm, it has 3 divisions, epimere, mesomere, and hypomere, but the one we're most interested in is called the ectoderm. Okay? From the ectoderm is developed the neural tube and the epidermis. Now, why are those important? The ectoderm gives rise to three things. The neural tube, and out of the neural tube develops our brain, pituitary glands, spine, and motor nerves. The neural crest also has derivatives that go to different parts of the fetus as it's developing, guiding its development, guiding its organic unfoldment. The autonomic nervous system ganglia, the sense organs, adrenal medulla, pigmented retina of the eye, cartilages of the voice box and head, and the epidermal layer that develops some cranial nerves, made a connection, good, some cranial nerves, smell, olfactory capacities, the inner ear structure, been hearing a lot about melanin, the inner ear structure, taste buds, hair, skin, the lining of the mouth and anus, anterior pituitary. It literally organizes the unfoldment. It's like the template of how a human being develops in the womb. And it's developed by a long, dark line. And it's a very important one. The point here is that melanin organizes embryonic development from the earliest hours and days after conception. Melanin is a semiconductor. Melanin, in other words, absorbs light quanta and can transduce it to other phases of energy. In other words, it has the capacity to absorb heat and translate heat into sound, or translate sound into light, or any of those convert back and forth. It's a pretty unusual kind of phenomenon. Melanin may also be a superconductor. For those of you who are interested in physics or have a biological background, it may be a superconductor at room temperature, which is an unusual phenomenon. Still very controversial, and there's a lot of research in that area going on right now. I want to make this one real clear, though. Skin melanin is not the same as neuromelanin. There's a lot of controversy about that, and that's how one of the things the media likes to seize upon and blow out of proportion and say that many of us in this community misunderstand. No, we understand it quite clearly. Melanin and neuromelanin are not the same. People in this room have different amounts of melanin in their skin. And if you go to China, generally have different amounts of melanin in their skin, Europe, difference in variations. Neuromelanin is the melanin in the central nervous system. And that's pretty much the same for all human beings. There have not been any studies of showing a significant difference between members of the human family in terms of neuromelanin in their central nervous system. What is interesting about neuromelanin also, however, is that neuromelanin increases as you rise up the evolutionary scale. In other words, different mammals have a certain amount of neuromelanin in their central nervous system. Okay? And you go to the primates, which are higher up in the evolutionary scale, they have each percentage more neuromelanin in their system. And then you go to the higher primates, and they have more in their central nervous system, until you finally get to the chimpanzee, and he has the most, until you finally come to a human being. So that's a pretty tight correlation. And again, if you think about intelligence, or if you want to, cosmic intelligence, and the capacity to absorb information and energy and light from the universe, melanin does that, has a way of incorporating that, transducing that to higher levels of unfoldment while evolution is occurring. Everyone also repeats during embryogenesis, during the time we're gestating in the womb, the same kind of development as our species has had for millions and millions of years. In psychology and psychiatry, this is referred to as ontology recapitulates phylogeny. It's a nice sounding phrase for talking about how things repeat themselves. The history of the race, to some extent, is repeated in the history of the individual. If you've seen fetuses at very early stages, they look like frogs, fish, then they look like mammals, and they're da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da-da. Well, that also happens in terms of human psychic experience also, I believe. Okay. Finally, I want to say that, and I'm not alone in this, that just as in the embryo, there's obviously some kind of intelligence going on that helps this embryo evolve, because it's a pretty sophisticated process of how an embryo comes from a very simple to a very complex state. I believe the same thing happens in human evolution, that there is an intelligent evolutionary force living in each human body, everybody in this room, that guides hominid and human development. It is expansive in nature, and selectively adapts to wider and wider circumstances, leading to greater and greater realms of awareness, consciousness, and expressive behavior in the world. We're going to return to that. And I want to jump over to another area and set a pillar so that we can have a firm foundation for what we're going to talk about next. Now, a brief foray into history and archaeology before we plunge into the psycho-spiritual dynamics of Osiris and Kundalini. By 15 to 20,000 years BCE, the Earth is populated by different tribes of Africoid human beings undergoing various degrees of skin, hair, nose, eye adaptations, and so forth. Those Africans who went into Europe, often called the Grimaldi Negroids, after a place the bones were found in Grimaldi, Spain, become the foundation for the later European races, the Alpine and so forth, European races. They are isolated in the ice. In order to adapt, those Africans have to undergo certain surface phenotypical changes. The nose elongates over time, and that's adaptive because it helps warm air coming through the nose and goes into the lungs. More clothes are worn, the sun hits it less, also the skin gets lighter. There's a whole involved sequence about metabolism of vitamin D, which is much too complicated to get into in the short time we have, but that contributes to the change in the lightening of the skin. Also, white skin is more adaptive to cold climates. It is much more resistant to frostbite than dark skin. During the Korean War, African American soldiers had 3 to 4 times as many frostbite cases as white soldiers did. Why? Because black skin does not deal as well with the cold as white skin does. It's merely an adaptation. The hair gets longer to protect the body, and that there's a thicker body built to retain heat. Okay. The lobe, as I say, gets longer, more narrower. There are lots of just surface adaptations that occur. Claw spingling is common, and commerce is fairly common during this time. But at this time, 15, 20,000 years BC, there's no written script to speak of. There's no metallurgy really to speak of. There's experimental with crop farming mostly in Africa, and cattle domestication also in Africa. Now, African tribes have migrated to Europe, Asia, Australia, the South Sea Islands, Japan, and even over into Bering Straits, into both North and South America, again everywhere except Antarctica. Then a new quantum leap in human consciousness begins with a cataclysmic change in the ecology. The great lush Sahara, once full of lakes, rivers, varied animal life, begins to dry up. We have satellite pictures of this now, where we can clearly see the outline of lakes, riverbeds, and so forth, this huge complex in the Nile Valley. It began to dry up. That was a cataclysmic change. It was also during that time when the Nile Valley was very lush that the Sphinx was built. If you look at the base of the Sphinx, it has a lot of water erosion marks. You don't get water erosion marks in a desert. It was built during a time in which it was lush with animal life, which indicates that there was a very high civilization prior to what we even know in Egypt and Nubia. A reference for this is Serpent in the Sky. Oh, there's also, interestingly enough, a video out about this. And I've seen the video, and most of it's pretty good, but even the video skirts some of the issue. It can't quite cut to the idea that these were African peoples. They sort of talk around it, and you can read through the lines, but they just don't quite come out and mention it. And it's most obvious when they're talking about the space of the Sphinx. Many people think that, or it was held for a long time, that Pharaoh Khephren was the figure for the Sphinx, and they're finding out now that's probably not. They reconstructed by computer graphics the face of the Sphinx, and he would have to have an extremely long nose to be able to do that. So it was obviously an African face. The Sphinx did not look the way it looked until recently. When Napoleon went into Egypt, And at that time, Africans were being brought out in droves to become slaves in the Caribbean. And until this time, people in Europe were praising ancient Egypt as a source of civilization and so on and so forth. When Napoleon's troops go into Egypt, they find the Sphinx, they see it, and they freak. And because he looks like the people we've been enslaving. So Napoleon's lieutenants blow off the nose of the Sphinx. It's a threatened return of the repressed. And philosophically at that time, European scholars become significantly less interested in classical Egyptian civilization, and they begin to get interested in ancient Indian civilization, and begin talking about Indo-Aryan civilization. So racism is not just the province of, also very much among the academics, except when the academics do it, they smile. So about 10 to 15,000 years ago, or rather 10 to 12,000 years ago, great migrations from the west and center of Africa began, leading to a confluence of commerce and cultures around the Nile Valley. There are not hordes of people coming in from the Middle East into Africa at this time. There are trickles of people, but not huge numbers. And there are not tremendous numbers of people coming in from Europe into the Nile Valley. This is the movement from the indigenous peoples of Africa to create that civilization. Nubia arises in present-day Sudan and the Ethiopian highlands. The first written experiments with scripts appear in Nubia. The first pharaohic structures appear in Nubia. The first experimentation with a pyramid begins in Nubia. The first metallurgical science begins in Nubia. The first exacting astronomy begins in Nubia. And most important for our discussion tonight, the first theory of salvation begins to take effect in Nubia. Walter Fairservice has an excellent book on the ancient kingdoms of the Nile and the doomed monuments of Nubia, in reference to the Nubia being anterior to even Egyptian civilization. Reality of the matter is that Egyptian and Nubian civilization are so close that it's really difficult to separate the two. The Egyptians and the Nubians did not make a distinction between each other in terms of race. They did it in terms of culture to some extent, but not in terms of phenotype. And they did make a distinction between themselves and Semitic peoples and European peoples, but not between Egyptian and Nubian peoples. That again is another way to divide people scholastically and academically, the same way that African peoples in Africa and Africoid peoples in southern India, i.e. the Dravidians, are thought of as different peoples. They are very close genetically, historically, and otherwise. For references, I suggest Cheikh Anta Diop's African Origin of Civilization, and also J.G. Jackson's Introduction to African Civilizations. Also, description of daily life among the peoples of the Nile Valley. There's an excellent description in Black Man of the Nile and His Family by the eminent elder Dr. Yosef Ben Yaknin. So, the Egypto-Nubian lands, that's how I'm going to refer to it, is Egypto-Nubian. Egypto-Nubian lands are referred to as Kemet, or Land of the Blacks, and there are 15 different ways to spell it. Choose the one that you want, but that's basically what it means. The Kemet means Lands of the Blacks. A number of things begin to happen here that are very important. Medicine begins to arise in this part of the world, and it arises because of the need for mummification and also battlefield surgery. There are huge battles going on here, but when you begin to mummify the bodies of the dead, you begin to learn a lot about it, and that's where many of the different anatomical terms come from. The Egyptians had over 200 different anatomical terms, or different anatomical parts of the body that they had identified. Dr. Charles Finch's book, a physician, Dr. Charles Finch's book, African Background to Medical Science, is an excellent book on this area. Also, if you want to go to the pirated originals, it's now called the Edwin Smith Papyrus, not because Edwin Smith wrote it, but because he happened to be an Egyptologist studying it, came across the manuscript, and took it back for, quote, safekeeping, unquote, to his museum, and it's referred to as the Edwin Smith Medical Papyrus. But it documents over 200 different anatomical terms. They were very sophisticated medically. Surgery was practiced, and even an early form of neurosurgery called trephination, where you open the skull to relieve pressure on the skull. Exacting medicines were used, special prescription, subsidies, subspecialties that had arisen during this time, and obviously great philosophers during this time. What I want to emphasize right here, though, during this time, is that during this time in ancient Egypt is the discovery of the unconscious. The discovery of the unconscious was not the discovery of Freud and Jung in the latter part of the early part of this century and the latter part of the last century. No, it was not. It was a rediscovery. And both, by the way, Freud and Jung said this. They knew that and they said so. But they discovered, the ancient Egyptians discovered the unconscious. One of the things that is important about the unconscious, if you're a clinician, you know that it's not enough to know that somebody has an unconscious mind. You need to be self-aware that there's an agency of the mind that is influencing the behavior outside of awareness. That is the unconscious element of the mind, instead of just going along and having it. So it's a matter of being self-reflective, self-aware, deducing that it's really there. The unconscious in ancient Egypt is referred to in two ways. It's referred to as the Amenta, or the all-black underworld of images, forces, beings, and symbols of the mind. It is a way to think about all these processes going on in the mind, arising and falling and influencing one's life and one's experience. Richard D. King, a brilliant psychiatrist, a friend of mine, has written the book, The African Origin of Biological Psychiatry, and I would suggest any of you that are remotely interested in this seriously to pick up a copy of this person's book. Also, in ancient Egypt, the unconscious process is referred to as the primeval waters of Nun. There's an excellent text called The Discovery of the Unconscious in Ancient Egypt by Eric Horning that refers to this over and over. So clearly, the unconscious mind is known in ancient Egypt, and they work with the unconscious mind. They use the unconscious mind in treatment with hypnosis, with dream analysis, pain control, and a number of other things. We have not really exceeded their technique. We've gone in different directions, but all the basic techniques of hypnosis you can find written in the early Egyptian texts. I know, I do it. And I teach it to psychiatry and psychology interns. I'm using essentially the same basic ideas. I'm using different languages and different forms and so on and so forth. It's still basically the same idea. So during this time, there's a great deal of experimentation in art, in science, and religion. But two are extraordinary and reflect upon our idea of a spiritual evolution unfolding from an African template. The first is the mythos and the spiritual drama of Osiris. The second, and closely allied, is the transcendent bioenergetic phenomenon of Kundalini. It is literally the evolutionary energy in human beings. First, the mythos of Osiris, and why it is the greatest, I believe, and the most inclusive of all the great myths of humankind. But first, what's a myth, and what influence does a myth have on culture? Okay? Not the literal truth. As we all know, whoever wins the war decides what history was. So myth is really the collective memory of the race about what reality is. You know, I assure you, if Hitler had won the war, we would have had a different understanding of what history was, right? Myth is the living memory of meanings, formations in time, and what different forces mold our lives. We all have myths. We have personal myths, we have family myths. If you were to ask someone to sit down for 5 minutes and describe who they were very quickly, what you would hear mostly are myths. This doesn't mean it's not true, but it means it's not the literal truth. It means that's the way that they organize their understanding of themselves or other people. People have different roles and potentials and situations in families and so on and so forth. These are family myths. So we all have these myths and we live by them. And if we don't have them, our lives are relatively empty. The greatest and most enduring myth of the modern age is the myth of science. Science is a myth. Doesn't mean it's not true. Parts of it are true, and parts of it are not true. Science is changing its mind every week. What was an experiment, what was a medical procedure you absolutely had to do 5 years ago, you don't do it anymore, right? So all of you out there who are worried about your prostates, Just sit on it for a while. So myth is really a multi-generational transmission of vital meaning, I believe, the living tissue of implicate and explicit intelligence and human experience across the ages. Now there's a whole family of human myths, and each one covers a certain area of human experience and covers it well and organizes our feelings about it and our understandings, our insights, our conflicts about it, but it makes it intelligible. Oedipus and Electra, both of those are ancient Greek myths, describe certain situations that occur in family situations, particularly family dynamics. Oedipus, the story of Oedipus where he's afraid of marrying his mother, so he escapes, but ends up eventually marrying his mother, and so on and so forth. That's about the dynamic tension, sexual tension between mother and son. Okay? And Electra is the same situation, but that's between father and daughter. That's what's called, in psychiatry, psychologists would refer to as the family romance. It's quite normal, it's quite healthy. It's just when it gets out of when the boundaries are crossed, the totem is crossed, that's when you have a problem. But that's a normal relationship, and in fact, if it's not there, you don't make a bond with the parenting person, so you have to have that. The Midas myth, another Greek myth. And this is about greed and downfall, where Midas has it all anyway. He wants more. One spirit, Icarus and his son, somehow are on an island, and they need to escape. They are intelligent, and they figure out that they can escape this island by using wax and discarded bird feathers and making wings for themselves. But father tells son, make sure we don't fly too close to the sun because it'll melt the wings and we'll crash into the sea. So they, through their intelligence and cleverness, they make wings and they begin to fly off, and they're heading for shore, and the son becomes what's called in psychology and psychiatry ego inflation. He feels so full of what he's done that he flies too high toward the sun. The sun begins to melt the wax, feathers come off, down into the sea he goes and dies. The father, keeping it predictable, keeping it steady, close to the ocean, he gets to the other side of the shore. So that's about the fall based upon pride. A Semitic myth, the myth of Job in the Bible. Here's one in which Job, nice person, God decides, I'm going to test him. And sends all kinds of bad news things to Job. But Job, even though he doesn't understand why this is going on, doesn't lose his faith. And because he doesn't lose his faith in God, even though he doesn't understand it, eventually he is redeemed and gets back everything he did before plus more. This kind of triangle eventually leads to the downfall of all three. The story of Camelot. I'm sure some of you can relate to that. Myth of Beowulf. The myth of Beowulf, where another hero, has to demonstrate courage and heroism and go and slay a beast. Okay. So you find a lot of those myths. Let's turn to West African myths. West African myths, at least from my point of view, are very direct expressions of deep psycho-spiritual dramas. There's the story, and in some cases the myth of Orunmila, in terms of the creation story, the Genesis story. Orunmila is a long involved story of how he creates, unfolds the world, but is it literally the story of Genesis, how all of this came to be out of nothingness, or apparent nothingness. Orunmila's other names are Witness to Creation and the Master of Expansion and Contraction. For those of you who are interested in physics, you know that a great deal of cosmology today is explaining this whole big trip about expansion and contraction. The Big Bang Theory, is that the one? Or is it a constantly expanding universe? Or does the universe expand and then contract? Essentially, that's what it's about, and there are all kinds of complicated formulas, but nobody really knows. So at bottom, it's still a myth, because we don't really know, despite the scientific quote-unquote data. Mustn't be too seduced by science. Have a healthy respect for it, but not be too seduced by it, because, again, it changes its mind on its significant beliefs every 40 years. The stories of the Yoruba's Obatala and his Ashe, and its Ashe or power, and especially the reascent of this Ashe. I'm going to come back to that later, because it's very, very important when we're talking about Kundalini and spiritual processes. There are also the stories and myths of the different Orishas. These are all about, from my point of view anyway, limited point of view, the dynamics of the spiritual phenomenon of Kundalini. Okay. The myth of Osiris. Osiris is sometimes called Osir or Wasir, depending on your particular sect or particular beliefs. And I'm only using the word Osiris because it's the most commonly used of the words. The Osiris myth, this is very important. The Osiris myth arises just before the first Kemetic Egyptian dynasty. And really it is the origin of Egypto-Nubian civilization. Wallace Budge, the late keeper of the British Museum, translated the Book of the Dead, the Egyptian Book of the Dead, which is better known as the Book of the Papyrus of Ani. But even he reluctantly has to admit that the origin of Egyptian civilization, which is the origin of the structures of modern civilization, is almost entirely due to the spread of this cult. Osiris is spoken of in the Egyptian Book of the Dead, the Papyrus of Ani, and it's compiled at the very least, and by compiled I mean written, at the very least 3,000 years before Christ, before the Common Era, and maybe before 5869 BC, depending on which Egyptologist you want to follow. But he's usually associated with the first Pharaoh, Pharaoh Menes, who united Upper and Lower Egypt, and he was obviously and clearly an African. He was not Asiatic, he was not European, he was not even mixed. We have statues of him. There's no way to explain it away. Believe me, people have tried. Tried to explain away Akhenaten. He wasn't really an African because he had an illness. And that's why his jaw was so long. But the ideas, the germinal spiritual ideas in the Papyrus of Ani predate even its compiling by many, many years, perhaps thousands of years. The pyramid texts of the Old Kingdom are really the bedrock of the Book of the Dead. Later ideas we find in the three principal, or the three dominant Western religions, all have their root in this book. The later ideas on the immortal soul, final judgment, judgment in the heart, conscience, heaven, hell, resurrection, all of these ideas are foreshadowed in the Egyptian Book of the Dead. They're included in the early what's called Theban Recision, and it's written on papyri and coffins, and it's written primarily in hieroglyphs, but it doesn't have any particular order. And later in what's called a Sayed Recision, which is anterior to the 26th dynasty, which lasted even into Ptolemaic times and later. You find the myth of Osiris, the cult of Osiris, practiced even in Rome and various parts of Great Britain. So it is a great religion, a great cult, and it really holds sway over the imagination of the ancient world for millennia. In the last one, the Sayed Recision model or rendition is written in three languages: Demotic, Hieratic, and hieroglyphic script. Now, the early Egyptians were not Proto-Semites or brown Mediterranean, as many European Egyptologists have said, and some still assert, although fewer, but instead were clearly indigenous Africans from the west, central, and eastern regions of Africa who migrated to the Nile Valley. Check Anta Diop's work, African Origin of Civilization, 1974, I refer you to. Also to Martin Bernal's 1987 book, Black Athena, The Afro-Asiatic Roots of Classical Civilization, and Basil Davidson's Africa in History. But beyond these historical analysis, we also have computerized and scientific analysis today to support this idea. There have been archaeological digs, even including the one most recently in Tasseti, 3300 BC, where they've analyzed not only the bones, but also the cultural artifacts, and these clearly civilization moves up from the south to the north. But there have also been craniometric studies that have gone into the graves, unearthed the skeletons, measured their skulls, and found out indeed that this is an African type. And finally, there is what's called a melanin granule test. If you put melanin under a mic, what they did is they went in and dug up some mummies, took some skin from some mummies, and looked under an electron microscope. And if you do, at certain times, treating it a certain way, the granules, melanin granules, will flare, and will give you some idea of the percentage of melanin in the skin. And the melanin in the skin was clearly the same as the indigenous black populations of the Africans in that area. Ivan van Sertima's work in Egypt Revisited is an excellent reference for this, in which he talks in more detail about those particular studies and the archaeological digs. Now, the great change, really, the great change that revolutionized the religious views of the early Kemetic Egyptians just before now the dawn of the dynastic era were due primarily to the rise and spread of the cult of Osiris or Osir throughout Egypt. This new doctrine held something radically different. One, that the dead body of a man was a sacred thing, not to be buried, or rather not to be burned or left out to rot or devoured by men or beasts or mutilated. This was a radical change. And also, the dead body must be taken care of, embalmed, mummified, and placed in a special concealed tomb, because it would from it later would arise the translucent, transparent, immaterial, and refulgent, glorious form in which the spirit soul of the deceased would arise and take up all of its faculties, mental, psychic, and otherwise. It was beginning the idea of resurrection and rebirth. Osir or Osiris is often associated with the anointed mummy, and often associated with cycles of renewal and rebirth. The historical Osiris, whoever he or she was clearly an avatar. An avatar is a human being who, for reasons that transcend present conceptualization, has the capacity to bring into the world a new order, a new conceptualization of what it means to be a human being, and to radically alter a person's or a human being's perceptions of things. Jesus the Christ was an avatar. Krishna was an avatar. The Buddha was an avatar. They usually don't lead armies. They come with an idea that revolutionizes the way people are. This cult of Osiris, this theory of salvation, I believe anyway, is the mind's projective symbol and memory or apprehension of the cosmic energetic process of E equals MC squared, where energy or light falls or is captured into the solid tomb of matter, only to be freed and reawakened to some future cycle of existence. This is an apprehension of what that process is like. Because the E equals MC squared, matter is repressed energy. This is energy. And if the energy is released from it, its form of energy is a form of light. All is light. The translated titles for the Book of the Dead, or the Book of the Dead, the Papyrus of Ani, but also the Book of the Coming Forth by Day and Manifested in the Light. The Osiris Odyssey unfolds all the stages, I believe, of human incarnation from prior to birth, life, love, family conflicts, sibling rivalry, betrayal, murder, death, faith, resurrection, and reawakening to divinity. All of those, I believe, are unfolded in the Osiris story. Now, there are variations of this story, slight shifts and changes, but I'm going to present primarily the one that is most popular, the most dominant one anyway. This was taken primarily from the writings of Plutarch, who was a compiler during that time, during the Roman and Greek time, of these earlier myths and earlier stories of Osiris, and also from Wallace Budge's book, Osiris and the Egyptian Resurrection. Remember, this story is over 6,000 years old. It captures the human imagination because it was able to talk not only about day-to-day bone and spit and blood life and relationships, but also divine relationship and incarnation. Now, the story is that the goddess Nut, wife of Ra, was beloved by another, Keb, another triangle. Ra discovers their relationship and becomes extremely angry, becomes so angry that he declares that his wife may not have a child in any month of any year. The god Thoth, usually associated with writing, also loves her and gambles at tables with another named Selene. And he wins for the Queen Nut a tiny part of each day of the year, which adds up to 5 days. Okay. Now, the Egyptian, interestingly enough, the Egyptian calendar was divided into 12 months of 30 days each, equaling 360 days. And the extra 5 days adds up to 365 days. They had a very exacting calendar. The calendar we use today is really the Egyptian calendar. It's not the Gregorian calendar. It's just, you look at your watch, you're telling African time. This calendar is exacting as the one we use today. It is the one we use today with some slight modifications, and appears to have been in usage at least 3246 BCE, before Christ, and probably a lot earlier than that. There are various dates. Cheikh Anta Diop gives an even earlier date. But it boggles the mind that this was in exacting use. People had this exacting measurements of the stars and the planets that far back. Now, supposedly on these 5 days of Nut, Osiris was brought forth. Supposedly also, other figures of the royal line were brought forth in the remaining 4 days. Horus, or Horu, the son of Isis and Osiris, came forth on day 2. Set, or Set, Typhon, becomes later on associated with the devil, comes forth in day 3. Set becomes Satan, model for the evil one. Also on day 4, Isis, wife of Osiris, is supposed to have come forth, and she is the archetype of the Black Madonna, the Black Madonna cult and religion that is worshipped throughout the world. There are shrines to Isis in ancient Russia. The Polish Solidarity movement has a Black Madonna as the head of their symbol. They have absolutely no idea why, but they do. And she was even worshipped as far as Britain and France. Paris was originally the site of a temple to Isis, Paris. Also, the sister, I should say, of Isis, Nephthys, I think is how you pronounce it, came forth on day 5. So there's a family unconscious process here. There's a cosmic process, but there's also a very intimate familial process going on. In other words, I've tried to elucidate what the unconscious dynamics of families are, particularly family relationships as expressed through psychosomatic symptoms and also parapsychological phenomena, because both of them profoundly affect psychic process and also physical processes in the body. But this family unconscious process is really at the root of this mythic drama. Now, at the moment of Osiris's birth, legend has it that a great voice proclaimed out that the Lord of creation has incarnated in the world. Now get the symbolism of the God-man, a God prior to being man, who freely not renounces, but contracting light again, contracts his or her divinity and becomes human, i.e. the Word made flesh. This idea that later appears in Christianity, particularly in the Judaic Christianity, the Messianic tradition, has its root here. In time, Osiris becomes king or pharaoh, civilizes his devotees, and then in a Messianic movement goes out to civilize other nations. His wife Isis rules the kingdom in his stead and does well. Upon his return, Set or Satan, who becomes the model again for Satan, plots with 72 comrades and the queen of Ethiopia, Aso, to betray and murder Osiris, who apparently seems to be his father. So we have an Oedipal drama here. Legend says that the secret plotters, by ruse, get Osiris's exact measurements, make a chest of his size, and then in a banquet, get Osiris to lay inside of the chest. As soon as Osiris gets inside of the chest, Set closes it very quickly and locks him in it. The chest is then taken to the Nile River, put up on the Nile River, and floated out to sea. This happened on the 17th day of the month of Hathor, when Osiris was either 28 years old or in the 28th year of his reign. Now, Queen Isis, who was away on the island, away in the land of Coptos, at this time eventually learns of this tragic turn of events, goes into a deep grief, and then sets out in search of the body of Osiris. Now, on her journey in search of Osiris's body, Isis learns that Osiris has sexually united with her sister while she's been gone. A little family thing there. And that they have a child. And the child's name is Anubis, a dog-headed god. Anubis, as a child, is taken out and supposedly exposed to the elements so that he would die. But, of course, he doesn't die. Okay. Isis and Anubis then, and other dogs, search out and search for Osiris's body, trace the chest carrying Osiris's body to the sea, to the ancient city of Byblos, where it has gently been laid by the waves in the branches of a tamarisk tree. If you remember, Byblos is where the word Bible comes from. Byblos was a city with a lot of religious ferment, and that's where the Bible has its origins, where it was first, part of it was first compiled. The branches of the tamarisk tree grow into a large and magnificent tree, enclosing the chest and the body of Osiris inside. The king of this land, admiring this chest, has it cut down and made it into a pillar for one of his houses, the roof of one of his houses. Learning of this, and how people learn this, we don't know, but learning of this, Isis, disguised as a nurse, gains admittance into the king's house. But instead of nursing the king's son, supposedly only gives him her finger to suck every night, and slowly throws parts of his body into the fire to have it consumed. In this way, takes away his immortality. Okay? One night, the queen of this kingdom suddenly discovers this and confronts Isis. Isis then reveals who she really is, the queen, in search of her husband. The other queen is moved by this and gives Isis the pillar and the chest inside of it with Osiris's body. Isis opens it up, looks at Osiris's body, is thrown into another grief, and the wail is so loud, legend has it, that it destroys a sleeping child of the king. Isis brings the chest back by sea to Egypt, hides it, and then sets out to locate her son Horus, or Horu. However, Seth, the evil one, while hunting by moonlight, discovers the chest and Osiris's body, cuts it up into 14 pieces, and then scatters it throughout Egypt. Isis hears of this new travesty, sets down the Nile in search of the 14 fragments of Osiris, and wherever she locates a fragment of the body of Osiris, establishes a temple. And from that temple, a city's life grows up. So you see how Osiris's body brings new life to the land. His head is supposedly buried at Abydos, his ear at Sais, dorsal spine at Mendes, left hand on the island of Bigdad near Phale, and so on and so forth. So Osiris is reborn throughout Egypt. By this time, Horus, child of Isis and Osiris, has grown up. Horus sets out to avenge his father's death and betrayal by Seth. So another huge, intense family argument. A battle ensues, eventually Seth loses. Horus conquers Seth, i.e. light conquering darkness. The angels of light win over the angels of darkness. Can you see the biblical story prefigured here? Seth is taken prisoner, but the compassionate queen, his mother again, frees her son. Horus comes back, finds out about this, flies into a rage, rips her crown off, but again, her secret admirer, Thoth, gives her a helmet shaped like a crown. So that you often see that Egyptian crown with cow horns, the cow's head of Hathor. Again, there are two other battles are fought. Horus, or Horu, the messenger of light, is again victorious over the dark, satanic forces of Seth. Light is established in the world by Horu, and resurrection and transformation is spread everywhere by the body of Osiris. Now, this is better than any daytime soapbox. So there are certain recurrent motifs in this myth, in this drama. It reveals, I believe, the divine nature of man even prior to birth. The voice proclaiming that the Lord of creation has incarnated in the world. The, quote, word made flesh, unquote. An interesting thing about melanin that I mentioned before in this connection is, again, melanin absorbs light. As the fetus is developing, it is attracting to it, as it becomes more complex, various forms and manifestations of complex experiments with light. Before the first, melanin orients itself toward light. Before the first heartbeat, melanin has begun to organize your central nervous system. In other words, the template of your life and your consciousness is manifested in light, and it is happening before the first heartbeat, before you're born. So you are literally a form or expression of light prior to your birth. It is also the fusion, this myth, I believe, of science and religion in a collective legend. It is the motif of the embodiment of an immortal soul in a mortal body. It's also the story of family unconscious dynamics of love, loyalty, longing, family romance, sibling rivalry, deceit, betrayal, sexual politics, death, grief, and resurrection, and return to the divine estate through transformation and eventually translation. The dynamics of light and intelligence, that is to say, the falling into the dark tomb of matter, then by passion, love, and death, reawakening to the prior light of pure spirit and intelligence is played out on the canvas of the collective mind here. And that collective mind issues from an African intuition of the world process. The sexual power dynamics of Oedipus and Electra are unfolded here in the family romance, the family drama. Issues of marital fidelity. The dynamics of Job, especially around sin, guilt, loyalty and belief, and redemption eventually again. The myth of Midas, I see greed for power and remorse eventually are played out here. The flight of Icarus, and it's say ego inflation, flight, and then eventual failure are played out here. The heroism that you find in King Arthur, Beowulf are presented here. Horu is actually the origin, perhaps the origin of the word hero. Another spelling or expression of Horu's name is Hero, H-E-R-U. Horus is really the luminous solar hero who slays the dragon of darkness. And for those of you who are students of world mythology, you know that myth, that story keeps coming up again of a hero, whoever he or she is, with a sword of light usually, going out and slaying the dragon in one form or another. Horu is the personification of light, while Set becomes Satan, the Lord and personification of darkness. Now, you should be very clear about this. Blackness is not darkness. Okay? Darkness is the inability to recognize light, and darkness is inability to move. Sloth is ignorance. The Egyptians did not equate blackness and darkness. That's enough. Other peoples have done that. The Egyptians and the Africans have not done that. In fact, the all-black underworld for the Egyptians was a black creative flux out of which manifested various phenomena. At the top of the Egyptian pyramid was the black capstone. So Osiris is the expression, I believe, of a soul's apprehension of the cosmic, energetic, psychospiritual world process. Now, what does that mean, essentially? It means that I believe, anyway, that the cosmos is a divine milieu of luminosity, energy, and intelligence. From it, from time to time, the divine principle descends or incarnates in matter in its more dense manifestation in the phenomenal realms. However, this dense matter of body and mental life holds within it a secret life and a fragment of the living eternal light. It never quite dies. When this matter itself falls or dies, the body falls or dies, falls apart, the hidden light and light reawakens or is re-erected, i.e. resurrection. This is the Osirian drama. This is also, doesn't take much imagination to see, but this is also the mythos of modern science concerning what the hell matter is. Matter is trapped light. Matter is literally gravitationally enfolded light. All of this is a manifestation of light. All that you see is a manifestation of light. It's only the tiniest part of light that actually comes through your visual field. The rest of it is unseen. Over 90% of the matter in the universe is unaccounted for. And they just don't know where it is. And it's referred to as dark matter. Yeah. 95% of the gravitational mass in the universe is unaccounted for. They just don't know where it is. But they can measure its effects. So the universe is really literally composed of whatever this mysterious dark matter is. And in embryogenesis, our own internal evolutionary development in the womb and outside of it is largely, not completely, but greatly and significantly influenced by the unfoldment of this intelligent dark process. So really the light, the visible light that we see is a tiny fragment of reality, that most of the light is unseen. Now, this prehension or apprehension of the world process, I believe, is at the root of the three dominant Western religions of today, of the Common Era. It is outlined in the Book of Ini, and each spiritual tradition will emphasize, as it has a right to do, whichever aspect of it is most akin to the needs of the peoples of the time or that particular group of people. In the Christian tradition, in the Book of Ini, the areas that are most incorporated and emphasized are the notions of the immortal soul, final judgment, heaven, hell, atonement, and salvation. In Islamic tradition, it emphasizes more the immortal soul and salvation by surrender to the divine law. And Judaism is traditional Judaism, an emphasis on the law and atonement. In some of the more mystical elements of Judaism, particularly the Kabbalistic tradition of Judaism that sprung up in full flower in medieval Spain, but actually has its roots earlier, you find the notion of the scattered eternal light lost in each person that's reawakened, expressed. For the Kabbalistic Jews, every person has a fragment of the divine lost within them. And salvation or redemption is the bringing together the scattered lights of God back into the body of God. This is the primary mythos behind that notion. This vision of the divine process sprung up in most of its flower after the Jews were persecuted by the Christians and were expelled from Spain, although it had its ferment during the time of that. And in fact, much of it was developed, I believe, during the 700 years, or the latter part of the 700 years, in which time in Spain the Jews were actually protected by the Moors. That isn't mentioned enough in history, but for 700 years, the Jews were protected by the black and Arabic, but primarily black Moors of Spain. Prior to that, they had been persecuted by the Romans in the latter part, and then, of course, as soon as the Moors are kicked out of Spain, who catches it but the Jews? 1492 was a heavy year. In the earlier part of that year, there's the Spanish Inquisition. 1492 also marks the time when Columbus discovers himself in the Caribbean. 1492 is also the year that the last African emperor dies. It was a heavy year. Now, what is this cosmic energy that we've been referring to? We're referring to it as light, as life force, and so forth. Well, I want to talk about it a little bit more. What is this secret life? In order to do that, talk about the phenomenon of Kundalini. Now, Kundalini is often referred to as the evolutionary energy. This living but subtle and luminous intelligent fire is thought of as a force that sleeps in the body of human beings and then gives rise to, when awakened, to both spiritual revelation and at least spiritual and religious inspiration. Kundalini is described often as a spiritual evolutionary force in man sleeping as a luminous serpent coiled 3.5 times at the base of the spine. This is a cross-cultural perception. You find the image of a serpent coiled 3.5 times, head down, in ancient Mexico, Egypt, India, Africa, Japan, South America, the Incas. So it's not that this is an idea that the Egyptians necessarily discovered and then told other people about. They were the first to discover it. But other peoples, as they just moved into civilization, moved into spiritual awareness, noticed this phenomenon. Because that is psychophysically, that's how it is located. There are also other expressions of it. It's symbolically seen as the Uraeus serpent in ancient Egypt, the staff of Hermes or the medical caduceus. If you've seen the staff of Hermes or the medical caduceus, which began in Egypt, not in Greece, you'll notice that there's a staff and there are two serpents, and they cross seven different points. Those 7 different points are the places in the body where the autonomic nervous system plexes are located, and they are rich in melanin and neuromelanin, those particular areas. Again, the melanin absorbs light. It's a conducer, it's a transducer of light. In India, those are often referred to as chakras. It means that there's something, it's a vortex of energy, and various spiritual traditions have different ways of activating that. The raised cobra, of course, of the Kemetics is another expression of it. The Hindu image of the Kundalini is the one that most of the world is currently most familiar with. But there's also the Dravidian imagery of the braided serpents together. And again, the Dravidians are the Africoid Indians of the southern part of the continent. They're the ones who create the original civilization there, and then it's later overrun. Now, historically, Kundalini is first spoken of in the Egypto-Nubian legends of the early kind of Tantra cults, the cult of the Nagas, the Tathonian cult of the shadow, the serpent cults. And this is around at least 5,000 BCE and probably earlier. Some put it at 6,000. A good reference for this is a book by John White, Kundalini, Evolution, and Enlightenment. But there are lots of other good references. Now, in Egypt, Kundalini is associated with a royal lineage a la the serpent crown, the serpent at the bow of the crown, the brow point, with the priesthood and initiation at the 3rd level, i.e. the sons of light. There are 3 levels of initiation in the Egyptian mystery schools. Those who just come in, the neophytes, those who are moving up through the system, and then those which the force has been awakened, and those who are fully awake, the sons of light, those who can move back and forth, who come forth by day and go forth by night. That's what that book means, to be free in the ocean of light, to translate light freely back and forth. It's also associated with the pineal gland in the eye of Horu, the messenger of light. The spinal column, there's a great deal of emphasis, appropriately so, in the spinal column, special postures, meditations, and breathing patterns in the early Egyptian texts on this. And this reaches even a different kind of refinement in India. Now, the knowledge and practice of Kundalini is spread on the trade routes between Egypt, Nubia, the Middle East, and especially in southern India. Southern India is populated by blacks who are phenotypically Africoid. There are also trade routes. In southern India, 1,000 years before the Indo-Aryan invasions of the north, the Dravidian civilizations at Harappa and Mohenjo-Daro have Kundalini as the focus of their spiritual traditions. And it's referred to as the Serpent Power. Yoga is practiced here, and the psychophysical techniques of Kundalini are refined here, especially various postures called asanas, where it is useful to be able to absorb and hold energy in a certain way by holding your body in a certain physical position. Certain breathing postures that modulate this energy, they're called pranayamas, and they also modulate and strengthen the nervous system. And also three different internal bodily locks, so when this energy moves through the body, it's just not haphazard, but as it's modulated and controlled. If it's not controlled, you can hurt yourself. There are three basic locks, one at the base of the spine, Muddhara, one in the pit of the stomach, and one in the throat. And those are coordinated with different breathing techniques. And so you have to get those down if you're going to move into this sphere. And also the chakra system is developed in India. It is prefigured in other places, but India is where it reaches its highest, I believe, refinement. But you can also see it, again, in the staff of Hermes, or if you're in the West African tradition and you've seen the Dambala, okay? Line, there's a serpent. That serpent crosses a line at 7 points. And those 7 points, again, correlate with the autonomic nervous system plexes, okay, that are both energy vortices, but also have melanin in them. Melanin transduces energy. So they were very aware of this secret energy, this secret life in the body. This whole technique, the whole technique of the sublime science is really to reawaken the primal force safely, can't emphasize that enough, to reawaken this force safely and have this fallen spark of the divine light reascend back up the spinal line into the crown, leading to illumination, enlightenment, and God communion. The subtle energies of the body that are associated with luminosity or light and creativity are channeled by the spiritual disciplines and then brought back up to the head. And we're going to talk about the head in a number of ways. Melanin and neuromelanin, again, you may recall, are intimately associated with photosensitive and generative processes of life. And this occurs, again, the first few days and hours after conception. Again, melanin, neuromelanin, quickly. Melanin guides and directs cellular organization in the womb, in the fetus, embryogenesis. It structures the development of the central and autonomic nervous system for all human beings. This is very important. It is found in all the major organ systems: stomach, heart, lungs, liver, GI tract, eyes, ears, brain, the endocrine system of glands, including the thymus especially, adrenal, thyroid, parathyroid, pituitary, and pineal gland. And again, melanin is not the same as neuromelanin. You must be clear about that. They originate from different places. Melanin, skin melanin, fluctuates. Neuromelanin does not. Melanin absorbs light quanta and can convert it to either higher or other forms of energy, or i.e. light to sound, heat to... Another good reference for this, in addition to Barr's book, is by a psychologist at Morehouse College, Tim Moore. His book, The Science of Melanin, just came out recently. It's an excellent summary of this. Melanin, as I mentioned before, may also be a superconductor at room temperature. In other words, it has the potential for quantum effects. Okay. Now, this path of energy descending and unfolding the early spinal line and neural crest and embryogenesis, this spinal line is the same one that occurs in evolutionary development. The more melanin in the brain and the central nervous system, the progressively higher the level of development and intelligence as you go up the hominid line. So it's the same one as in the evolution. It's the same one in embryogenesis, it's the same one in evolution. It's the same line that translates light. It is also the case that this evolutionary track, one based, I believe, on an early and baseline African template, is the same path by which spiritual energy, or biolight, reascends up the higher spine and up to the cortical higher brain centers. Many allusions are found to the reascent of this energy throughout the world's spiritual traditions. In the Christian tradition, for those of you who are Christian, the story of climbing up Jacob's ladder is about this. In terms of its descent, the story surrounding the descent of the Holy Ghost to the apostles is about the descent of this force brought about by a great avatar. In the Indian tradition, it's referred to as Shaktipat. It's the awakening of the spiritual force. Tiny fragments of that occur when a minister will be talking to a congregation, and the congregation is very moved, and somebody will periodically shout, "Yes, Jesus!" Well, they just got a little spark of that energy at the base of the spine. Boom. Okay? In the theology of Ifa, let's turn to West Africa for a little bit. They talk at great length and explain at great length, and the secret societies work at great length about the descent of Obatala's Ashe, or light power, into matter. This leads to the awareness of the ethical principles inherent in creation, of being here, now, what one should do in one's life. Then there is a shift from these survival needs to salvation with the reascent of Obatala's Ashe from Ili, i.e. Ili Ife, back to Orun or Orunmila. This is about the descent of this energy into matter, doing whatever one does in the world, and then reascending back. It is the power of Ashe. It is really the power of Orunmila and Oshun that makes this possible, ultimately, the male and female principle. You find a similar idea in early Dravidian ideas of Shiva and Shakti. Shakti being associated with the female principle in Kundalini, and power is awakened and made to reascend back up into the head, the seat of consciousness, Shiva, the all-pervading consciousness. So energy is associated with consciousness, and that leads to enlightenment. So you see how the world's traditions have different ways of talking about this really deep primordial phenomenon, a phenomenon that comes primarily out of an African template or organization of the world process. Ori, in West African traditions, means head. It's Ori, head. And Ashe is associated with power and light. When Ori and Ashe put together, you have Orishe, Orisha. The Orishas are the elder ancestral consciousness that fuses with the elements of nature. And that's what an Orisha is. An Orisha is sort of an ancestral spirit that is fused with nature. And it is an awakened, say, it's not someone simply who has died, but someone who was very special, had a special contact with nature, and their spirit has fused with nature, and they become an Orisha, 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 two together. The Kemetic Egyptians knew of this, and perhaps were the first ones to use or talk about this spiritual energy in any kind of way that we can understand today. They call the Kundalini, they knew of as the Uraeus serpent. It was the source, again, of royal power and divine lineage. The crown, Egyptian crown, has a serpent jutting out from the forehead at the level of the vertex of the cranium. Okay? Its body extends backward in a serpentine motion down the middle of the cranium around the two hemispheres of the brain. The Kemetic term for this was what? WPT, meaning to open, to discern, to judge. It was a symbol of opening to higher cortical powers in the brain, i.e. the sons of light, the fully awakened one, the fully awakened staff or ankh of life. Vudan, for those of you who are into the West African tradition, Vudan mentions the doctor as being strong in the head, strong in the Ori. The West African practitioner, the Babalewo, has his Ashe strong in his head or Ori. Again, in the awakened ancestors is the Ori Shah. Okay, now that's all about theory and to some extent theology and outside. What about our own bodies? Those of us who are very much incarnated. Many spiritual adepts, past and present, have described the movement of this bioenergetic evolutionary force through their own bodies. This intelligent, luminous current that lives usually asleep, 3.5 beatific visions, waves of bliss and ecstasy. In some traditions, it's thought of as being spirit-possessed. The sense of the Holy Spirit of God communion occurs. But always there is a bodily sense attached to it. It's not dissociated from physical human experience. It's usually intensely pleasurable, often erotic and orgasmic, but intensely luminous. The ego is eclipsed by these phenomena for a short period of time. Doesn't mean that nothing is there, but the self, in its traditional way of understanding itself, is radically outshined by this other kind of phenomenon. Different adepts in the past have mentioned this. Plotinus, Ramakrishna, Bukul here in the West, Saint Teresa Avila, the Egyptian mystery schools again when they talk about the sons of light, the Gnostic Gospels talking about the Holy Ghost, the Upanishads of ancient India, and the Vedas and the Rishis of India, the Kabbalah of West Africa. Many different ways to talk about it adepts have in the past. But what about modern experiencers of this kind of phenomenon? Well, it doesn't necessarily involve a lot of obsessive verbal metaphysics. The Kum of the Kalahari, West Africa, in their religious ceremonies have found a way to awaken Kundalini, and it's associated with rhythm and movement. Very much with rhythm in the feet that stimulate the spine. I'll go further. They stimulate the spine in a frequency that has overtones of 7.5. Let me say that again, because I know I'm being taped, so I want to be real clear about that. Overtones of 7.5. Okay? Reason for that is kind of complex to go into right now, but let me say in effect that if you take a beam of electromagnetic radiation and you bounce it between the Earth and the ionosphere, the time it takes to go around the Earth divided by the distance of the Earth comes back in multiples of 7.5. There is a locking in that occurs. There's a certain rhythm entrainment that occurs. Okay? Those of you musicians know that rhythm has the capacity to help people enter into trance. Those of you who've experienced either possession or watched somebody in possession knows that each Orisha has a particular signature to their song, to their dance. These are all multiples of variations on that. For the Kalahari Kum, it is around movements of energy and spirit through the body, particularly when they are, quote, mounted by the Loa, unquote. A certain spirit possession phenomenon occurs there that seems to me, anyway, closely associated with the phenomenon of the awakening of Kundalini. It becomes personified. This phenomenon, I want to make this absolutely clear, this phenomenon is not without risks to one's health and requires discipline and personal training in order to be safe. Enormous amounts of energy are released in the system that can be physically and psychologically destabilizing. It's an exact science, and one has to approach it like you would any other science. Now, I want to talk in more detail now about one particular adept's experience. One modern adept's description of this I'm going to give right now. And I want you to particularly note something. Please note the bodily experience of light, the internal perception of energy and movement, pleasure. Please keep in mind also our earlier discussion about the phenomenon of melanin and neuromelanin and its places in the physical body and its associations with light and energy. Now this is taken from Gopi Krishna, a modern adept who died recently, but he awakened Kundalini almost, he didn't do it by accident, but he sort of stumbled upon it, and it was a very destabilizing experience for him. It's recounted in a number of his books, including The Awakening of Kundalini, The Secret of Yoga, Kundalini, the Evolutionary Energy in Man, The Dawn of a New Science, and many others. He headed a research institute in India where biologists and physicists continue to study this phenomenon. So, three different descriptions. The first one. The first symptom of the awakening was a sensation of light in the head, Ori. It was not as if I were seeing the light or that I had an inner vision of light, however. Rather, it seemed as if a stream of liquid light were entering my brain. I felt the stream of liquid light moving through all my nervous system, in my stomach, in my heart, in my lungs, my throat, in my head, taking control of the whole of my body. It flowed like a luminous stream from all my organs to my spine and up to my brain. It was an intelligent, purposeful energy. Now, as I said, when Gopi Krishna recently stumbled upon this, he was doing meditation, but he didn't have any formal training in it, but he was just very disciplined in the sense that he would sit every day and focus at the top of his head. And then one day, after years and years and years of focus, it happened. But he did it the wrong way. It came up the wrong channel, and it almost killed him. You see, go back to the image of the medical caduceus. There is the staff, and there are the two serpents, or else at Dambala there's one staff and one serpent. But the point is, it crosses it 7 times. Okay. In the traditional techniques of yoga, particularly Kundalini yoga, the practitioner has to neutralize the two serpents that are associated with the sympathetic nerve and the parasympathetic nervous system. You have to neutralize them. You do that with certain breathing techniques, particularly what's called, they cross like this. You have to neutralize them with certain breathing techniques so that the energy comes up the central canal. You apply the technique of what's called application of sushumna, which means you neutralize those two so that the energy comes up the middle, so that it's a neutral energy, so that it doesn't burn you out. Gopi Krishna literally felt his body was on fire. It's because it came up the wrong channel. Okay? So it's very important. And also, he did not have those 3 internal bodily locks. Those 3 internal bodily locks are important because you have to be able to stop the energy from rushing all the way to your head. You know? I mean, it's one thing, and it's a very glorious thing, to be possessed by the Spirit, say, in church or temple for a brief period of time. It feels wonderful. But can you imagine that, and then it just stays that way for days? It'll burn you out. Okay? So you have to be disciplined in doing that. You can't send 500 watts of electricity through a 60-watt bulb. Now, this next quote, also in Kundalini, talking about our own physical bodies, talks a little bit more about the relationship between eroticism and generativity, because it's very close to ecstasy and pleasure. They're very closely associated in this kind of phenomenon. The human seed is not the product of the gonads alone. And when he speaks about this, Gopi Krishna, like most adepts who wrote about this, was a male. But it is not by any means exclusively associated with the male phenomena. The male reproductive system is equally so with the female. In fact, Kundalini is associated with the female power. Okay? So when he talks about reproductive, he's talking about it from the male's point of view, but it's equally a female phenomenon. The human seed is not the product of the gonads alone. It is a compound of a subtle organic essence drawn from the body by the nerves, melanin from the melanocytes, and the secretion produced by the sexual organs of this subtle nervine essence that is, in reality, the concentrated fuel of life. The ancient notion that the male seed is actually produced in the head, strong in the head, Ori, and from there descends into the genital organs has therefore some foundation of truth to it. And finally, the idea expressed in the Upanishads, the Upanishads are the oldest written scriptures of India along with the Vedas, the 4 Vedas. The idea expressed in the Upanishads that semen is drawn up from all parts of the body, including the vital organs, is nearer the mark. In the normal individual, there occurs a constant process in the nervous system that is imperceptible to us still undetected by science. The subtle element that imparts vitality to the seed is imported by the nerve linings lining the reproductive system from all organs and tissues in the heart, in the body, and the head. This includes the heart, the head, lungs, liver, stomach, intestines, spleen, kidneys, genitals, and the rest. This organic element is extremely subtle, extracted and carried by the nerves in such a minute measure that it remains beyond detection by us. This sounds to me like the bioluminescence phenomenon of melanin and neuromelanin. It is associated with streams of energy that flow into the spinal reservoir of Kundalini and then enters into the vast ocean of the brain. Again, melanin and neuromelanin are semiconductors and photosensitive. Melanin absorbs light. They transduce or convert energy from one form to another, from light to heat to sound and back. They are distributed to all the vital organs of the body, including the endocrine system. Neuromelanin increases in percent with the increase in evolutionary intelligence. And, very importantly, neuromelanin increases with age in the brain, leading, I believe, to the increased wisdom vision of elders. Melanin guides embryonic development in the womb from the central nervous system to create the organs, skins, and glands. This is a universal human phenomenon, and I also believe reflected in the Mystery of Osiris. The Mystery of Osiris unfolds a human incarnation from the light prior to birth through the travails of life to the soul's destiny that appears and opens beyond the grave. The universe is a vast, complex, minute, and also interstellar organ of light and intelligence with many cross currents, loopholes in space-time, and matrices of transformation. The secret life and light we all carry is an intimate part, I believe, of the expression of the life and light of the universe. This is absolutely true. So, in summary, I'd like to recapitulate some of the primary motifs and ideas that have come up. Try to talk about an African template of embryological and spiritual evolution. Man, modern man, or Homo sapiens sapiens, is rooted in an African genesis or an African template of evolutionary unfoldment. This includes all human beings, whether they live in Africa, the Americas, Russia, China, Japan, anywhere. This African evolutionary drama contains not only our historical, morphological, archaeological, anthropological development, all that, but also each living human being's personal biological genesis or embryology, and their deep psycho-religious template or all-encompassing spiritual drama is then enfolded from this African template also. Homo sapiens sapiens and all his hominid lineage from demure Ramapithecus maybe 12 million years ago in the Miocene age, who was both the parent of apes and hominids, through Australopithecus ramidus 4.5 million years ago, Australopithecus afrinus, who stood upright, traveled in families, but did not leave Africa, through the lush profusion of the later Australopithecines, Australopithecus africanus, Bosai, Robustus, Gracile, Ethiopius, all of those who didn't make it, through the funnel of the more sophisticated hominids who gave birth to Homo habilis, the tool-maker, about 2.5 million years ago, down to Homo erectus about 1.5 million years ago, the first one to leave Africa and travel to Europe and Asia. All these arose out of an African context, in the African milieu. But this African milieu not only produced the first type of man, but it also produced the last. All stages evolved in the African highlands and savannas, including the present stage Homo sapiens sapiens, thinking man. There are only surface phenotypical changes and mutations of the Africoid type due to ecological and climatic needs. There are no speciations and there is no polygenesis. Racial diversification began within this African Homo sapiens sapiens template only about 25 to 30,000 years ago. Prior to that, all Homo sapiens sapiens throughout the globe were Africoid, even those in Asia, Europe, Australia, and a few that had just made it to the Americas. They were not only Africoid, they were very dark-skinned due to Gloger's law, which stresses that, again, mammals in a warm and a rather humid and hot climate have to be of dark skin to protect themselves from the sun's ultraviolet radiation. It is merely a natural adaptation. And with no ambivalence. This also means that most of hominid psychological development, our deepest collective unconscious mental archetypes, are Africoid in nature. And this includes those who are persecuting us. Many of us do not believe that human evolution is a matter of natural selection and adaptations based on random events and only climatic shifts and changes and adaptations to that. For us, for many of us, these are essential forces, to be sure, but there appears to be a progressive, albeit discontinuous, unfoldment of higher and more inclusive orders in nature, a progressive manifestation of more and more subtle and expansive expressions of consciousness in nature. Human evolution, while apparently chaotic and reactively adaptive at times, also appears, like both embryological development and the growth of civilization itself, to be at least partially guided and nurtured by intelligence and teleology. Alfred Russel Wallace, the co-formulator of the modern theory of evolution with Charles Darwin, and I say modern theory because the theory of evolution was prefigured in the Memphite theology thousands of years ago. But the modern form of organic evolution that I share Gopi Krishna and others believe, that mankind is slowly evolving toward a sublime state of consciousness of which fleeting glimpses have been afforded to us by all the great seers and mystics of the past and the present. There is no doubt that some of the leading intellectuals of this era accept the existence of an evolutionary impulse in the race, but the ultimate goal and the modus operandi of the impulse, according to them, are still shrouded in mystery. We've seen how the human embryo, guided by the organizing capacity of light-sensitive and quanta-absorbing melanin, profoundly influences the central nervous system, organ and endocrine system, unfoldment and development for every human being, regardless of surface racial appearance. This is a living expression of the intelligent, luminous evolutionary impulse of our species. It arises from darkness, attracts light to it, then becomes more complex through this unfoldment. Our species began and reached its present form in Africa. It is perhaps also no random accident that human civilization, with its arts, sciences, metallurgy, measurements, written scripts, and monuments, also began in Africa, and not too far from the birthplace of the species, and then spread like an embryo to the rest of the species, who in a feedback loop then enrich the source, because we all cross-fertilize each other. Human diversity is primarily the way that evolution finds a way to express more and more intelligence. In this climate, it seems only natural that the first quantum leap in spiritual consciousness, the first prototype of the theory of salvation, the first reaching of the mind beyond the earth, should be foreshadowed in the mythos of Osiris, and that this should also arise in this same fertile soil. It's no accident. The cross-culturally recognized root of myriad spiritual traditions, the phenomenon of Kundalini, and its serious study was also, again, perhaps not coincidentally, uncovered in ancient Africa. This evolutionary force gave rise to the Osirian legacy, and this legacy gave rise to the first human civilization. In our own birth, our own embryogenesis, we repeat this evolutionary drama, and in our embodied lives live out the conflicts, struggles, triumphs, and tragedies outlined in the Osirian drama. Then perhaps return to our luminous, mysterious origins when disciplined consciousness transcends the body, mind, and the local field of nature. We are spiritual beings having a human experience. We are primarily spiritual beings having a human experience. Each psycho-spiritual discipline, whether it be Christian, Islamic, Judaic, Yogic, traditional West African, Buddhist, Hindu, or free seeker, has found a fragment, a way to organize some of this discipline, some of this information, and operate it in its own spiritual discipline. Each, I believe, each human being, each one of us in this room, must embrace this in a way that conforms to our style, our bodily experience, our intuition, and our tradition. There are many ways up to the mountain. There's not only one way. There are many ways up the side of the mountain. Do it slowly or do it quickly, but surely do it in this lifetime. It is the radiant evolution of the limits of the earth right now. 10,000 years ago, the earth looked very different to us than it does today. At our true nature, the nature of beings of light. In this sea of light, we are intimately connected with each other, a subtle, living tissue of a common flesh. In this sea, we share a common birth, a common destiny. Someday, after we have transcended all the contractions of the body-mind, neuroses, and the pulls toward war and self-destruction, we shall turn our attention to the wider sciences of the spirit. At that time, the luminous serpent, awake and full, will be the birthright of every incarnation. The consciousness of the one will be the consciousness of all. Then, and only then, the ancient race of Homo Sapiens will, like the mysterious snake, shed its skin and mate its consciousness with the divine consciousness of light. This is our destiny. Let it be so. Hotep.
Sisters and brothers, I think this is indeed a sacred moment, and I just don't want to touch it, because anything I can say. No, give you some time to rest. Oh, the brother's ready to go again, but I think he should rest. Don't you think so? Yeah, he's stretched out, and I only think that, in fairness to him, as he prepares for some questions, that he should just take a couple of minutes. But as I said, personally, I just feel that we should just suspend the lecture series. You take this tape home and go and study it. That's right. Because this brother has thrown out so much stuff that it will take years and years and years to digest. Have you ever heard anything like this? Yes. I have. I mean, my brother, once again I say, we deeply appreciated this. And I'm sorry that more folks did not come out here today. A little rain kept them, but I'll ask you a personal favor if you consider us again in the future. And this time we go about knocking some heads and dragging some bodies again. Good old-fashioned way. But this was indeed a sacred moment. And I truly believe that in the Kemetic order, this is indeed a son of light, a creator. Because as he explained, in the Kemetic system, there are 3 stages where you're going and you become neophyte, and then you rise up to be a son of the sun, a true son of the sun, or a daughter of the sun, son of light. And this is a manifestation of what we are. Because I have never heard spread of millions of years in our experience laid out like this. And there must have been something more in this brother. And I saw Baba Shinda. Where's Baba Shinda? Yeah. I mean, Baba Shinda, I think you should speak to, because he has been saying some of the things you're saying and connecting up with some of the ideas that you've explored with us today. And as an elder, when you say that being an elder is being wise, you see some of these manifestations. And who here does not know Baba Shinda? Because you see, the first thing Baba Shinda does is what? He shows you his writings.
and the ideas he shares with you. So I think that it is incumbent on each and every one of us to take this, make sure we get this tape, and go over and over, because it's no way you can get it in 2 or 3 takes, because this brother has thrown up so much of information. It's overwhelming. It's overwhelming, and we deeply appreciative of your time, your scholarship, your hard work, because can you imagine what it takes to put together something like this?
Yeah.
And this brother works. This brother has a regular JOB like each and every one of us.
Yeah, I can appreciate.
So you can see that the spirit truly moves this brother. That this is the spirit, because he has to deal with his own responsibilities on the job, then come and put in this kind of preparation. Where does he find the time? How does he do it? The spirit. And you can see the explanations he has given that you won't get anywhere. I'm sorry that the folks who generally are upstairs, we can bring them down so that they'll understand what they're doing when they say they get the spirit. Thank you, Jesus. And we get a better insight into what it is. We still have to keep going through and exploring so that we can evolve.
It was kind of crazy because I didn't understand it, and they made us stop doing it, in the army, because people would just be passed out, meditating, and just be pushed over or something. And the question I wanted to ask you is, the positions you were talking about, which are very important. Do you have a book to illustrate that? Or it's just like I used to try to get into the lotus position, which it took me a couple of months to get into, and now I don't even try it. Is there any easier position to get into so you wouldn't get out the
Yes, there are a lot. No, I don't have a book of illustrations out, but I would suggest that if before you do any complicated forms of yoga or yoga meditation, then it would be good to be very well grounded in some of the basics, such as Hatha Yoga. And there are a lot of good, straightforward videotapes of people who do Hatha Yoga. And I would do those. I'd read about it some more. I'd make sure my diet is regulated. Nothing extreme, just a regulated diet. Make sure your emotional and intimate and sexual economy is relatively regulated. All the basic foundational stuff. And then the base is more stable. And then from a stable base, it's easier to dance with different kinds of things that happen. Keep it simple.
Come on. Who's name?
Come around.
You know, you ever outer space? Can you bring it closer to you? No, it's up. Go ahead, speak. Excuse me. You know any evidence for this life outer space? UFOs and stuff?
Do I have any evidence that there's life out of space, in outer space?
Yeah.
I don't have any evidence. The only things I know about that are the various reports that appear from time to time of people's sightings of extraterrestrial phenomena. They describe them. The numerous reports of people who've been abducted by unknown spacecraft or various beings that they can't identify. But beyond that, that's the only information I have. It's a reasonable speculation that we're not alone. But I don't know personally. No, I don't.
I would like to ask you, like, the psi bank.
What?
The psi bank. PSI.
Oh, psi. Yes, yes.
Can you shed some light on that for me?
I've heard Dr. Chu expound on this subject, and she was making the projection that this side bank actually is a collection of all the thoughts which the universe has conceived of from the beginning until now.
Well, I don't know about that, but I do know that the study of psi, spelled PSI, is usually associated. Can I just talk here? Yeah, usually associated with the study of what's called anomalous data. It used to be called, still is called ESP, but it also includes other kinds of paranormal phenomena such as ESP, telepathy, crisis telepathy, which occurs when a person is dying and someone else who's closely related to them has an apparition of them at the time of their death. And clairvoyance, clairaudience, in other words, unusual mental or psychic capacities that people have that I believe and many other people believe are latent in the human nervous system, in the human psyche, and under certain circumstances can either be stimulated, awakened, or there are people who come to birth and who appear to be much more sensitive or in tune to that than other people for reasons that are very complex and nobody quite understands. But the field of psychic phenomena is generally called psi, PSI, by experimenters in the field. One of my interests is in family process, and one of the books that I've written is how psychic phenomena of different kinds, such as ESP, paranormal dreams and so forth, occur within a family context. Like crisis telepathy usually occurs within a family context. Simple experience of having a dream and then having it come true, paranormal precognition. Dreaming about someone and then finding out later on that someone had that same dream that you were dreaming about. That happens very often among people who have been particularly intimate couples who've known each other for a long time. I have an interest in that, and I've written a book that partially covers that called The Family Unconscious. It also talks about how medical symptoms are influenced by family dynamics. So, to sort of say it in a nutshell, psi usually covers the field of anomalous phenomena or parapsychological phenomena. It's a very ancient study, and some of the most eminent scientists of the 20th century in the past have been involved with it. Freud believed in it. He was very ambivalent about it, but he believed in it. Some of the leading physicists of the day believe in it. Carl Jung wrote several books about it. So it is a taboo subject in many areas, but 75% of people in the United States believe in it.
Okay. Do you think there's a connection between the side bank in terms of carrier of information available to everybody and the amount of melanin that one carries in one's body, and also the DNA strands?
I don't know anything about the DNA strains. I do believe that there may be a connection with the capacity of people to transduce energy from one form to another that is connected with melanin, but it's very important to recognize that would be the melanin connected with the central nervous system and not melanin connected with the skin. There are different amounts of melanin in the skin of different peoples, but there is no known difference in the central nervous system melanin. There may be some difference in inner ear melanin among peoples, but that's still very controversial. Because in terms of your brain, if we opened up your brain, we wouldn't be able to tell whether you were an African, a Russian, or a Chinese. And that doesn't seem to affect your psi capacities. But it is also the case that people who have and respect long traditions in which they're able to go into religious states of religious trance and ecstasy are much more open and responsive and to that kind of phenomenon, and are not as psychologically defended against it. And the fact that you are less defended against it makes it much more likely for you to recognize it. It doesn't mean it's necessarily more that it occurs more in you. You just may be more sensitive and recognize it more. Does that answer your question? Okay.
Hotel.
Hotel.
Do you have any conceptions of
reincarnation?
Yes. One that reincarnation, I believe, has been primarily a religious idea for a long time, but that the understandings of modern science are helping us come to recognize that it is not only a philosophical and a religious idea, but maybe the expression of the way energy in the world process operate. E equals MC squared. Matter is neither created nor destroyed, but transformed from one form to another. And one of the primary dictates or structures of fundamental assumptions of the ancient Kemetic worldview is that the universe is a dance of energy. It's in constant processes of transformation. So it naturally would grow out of that reincarnation is another form of transformation.
Is that like, would that be the reason for man's continued improvement? The fact that what was done in the past is being built upon? Because there was a time that there were no aircraft, no cars, probably no buildings with walls, and it keeps building.
I don't know if it has to do with reincarnation, but it does have to do with the ability of human beings to organize their material life, and I believe that organizing material life reflects to some degree, the increasing organization of one's internal or spiritual life. It is my own limited belief that this adventure in matter and space and time that we're all having as spirits is a world of testing for us, you know. And if you want to extend that to reincarnation, I mean, if you really want to extend that into reincarnation, then you have to accept not only, and this might be an unpopular idea, have to accept not only that in this historical period you or we are being oppressed, but that at some time in the past we have been the oppressors.
I had thoughts about that. Another idea. You mentioned about us being a form of energy, form of light energy. I always thought that there was more to life than being born, getting a job, so-called making it, and dying.
I hope so.
What you said today, you know, that kind of reinforced my belief that there has to be something. There has to be something more than just coming out and then going back to the earth. I feel strongly.
I agree. But coming up and going back to the earth is also noble. It's just that I think that we are involved in an adventure that is infinitely beyond what we can presently conceptualize. I really do. Infinitely beyond it. The mental is only one shade of the way consciousness is. There are lots of different shades of consciousness.
And another question. For the guy that was practicing yoga, I'm a practitioner of transcendental meditation. So if you need any advice as how to go about it, you know, I can probably help you. Okay? Please, my brother.
I want to know, is there other ways to approach and deal with our self-esteem in our youth? How can we approach them? How can we uplift them?
Well, that's kind of a large question.
Serious problem.
It's a serious problem, but I guess the best example is, you know, what we do, how we try to handle our lives, and to show them that struggle is noble. But that's a vast political question, and for me to do that justice, we'd have to be talking for a long, long time. There are elements going on out there in the political dialogue that are, I should say, positions, some are liberal, some are conservative, that we can learn from. And I think part of the struggle for us in the present age is to find out what of the old philosophy was useful and what we should retain and what we should throw off the side and what we should move on with. It's a complex question, and there are honest differences between honest people. But it's quite clear that some of the old formulas don't work anymore. They don't work anymore. So we're going to have to try something new. But I have faith in the species and faith in the race that we will get past it. Things have been rougher than this before. A lot rougher. And we're still here.
You have a question?
Yeah, of course.
Well, come on over there.
All right. During the course of your presentation, when you dealt with religions and things like this is a problem. We have a major problem looking in the field of religion. I think most of us, we have a Eurocentric or very external perspective on religion in terms of looking at religion in terms of labels, historical time frames. But your approach tended to be more in terms of looking at religion from a metaphysical perspective, like the major Western religions.
Metaphysical and also physical.
Right. How can you lay out some sort of framework in which we can start to utilize to look at these things beyond dates and antagonisms, labels, where we think beyond to see the, like I said, metaphysical and physical, how we start to look at these things in a more tolerant fashion. We just idle all the time. These three major Western religions, this, that, they're foreign to us, they're not part of our culture, and seem to have a more tolerant framework to look at these things.
Well, that too is a complicated and deep question. My approach, again, is limited as it is, would be to find what elements in each religion point to the common, point to the universal. You know, when you go and you look at a great play in the theater, what makes it a truly great play is how it speaks to the universal in all people. That's why somebody from Japan can so go and see Fiddler on the Roof adapted to the Japanese setting and feel that it speaks to them because it speaks to certain universals. While you can listen to a great piece of music and despite where it may have come from, recognize the genius in it because it speaks to the universal. Well, the same in religion. What parts of the religion are merely hostile, narrow, and conflict-producing, and which ones lead you to open to the transcendental current that flows through you and interfaces with you and everybody else. You know, if you look at the heart of Judaism, the heart of Christianity, the heart of Buddhism, the heart of Islam, they say pretty much the same thing. Christianity says to forgive one's enemies, to forgo. The Hindus say to be non-attached, to let go. Islam mentions surrender, let go. And the Eightfold Way of the Buddha, one of the principal reasons for suffering is the clinging to illusions. They're all saying let go. If you go a little further, particularly some of the Eastern religions, they'll say that and point out that your insides, what you think of as yourself most intimately, is empty. That doesn't mean there's nothing there. It just means it's made up of various kinds of illusions. And it's difficult to let those go. And when you begin to let them go, you feel very anxious. But that's part of the thrill of the mystical experience, is the final transcendence of various ego boundaries. People who have true religious spiritual experiences, transcendent spiritual experiences, come back and they see God in everybody. They rarely say, let's go to war. They go around and they see God in everybody. They often laugh a lot. They're often not as attached to things as before. They have a different vision of things. That's difficult for most people to do for obvious reasons. And therefore, in a more secular way, look at the core of any religious intuition and look for the universal in it, or, if it's a matter of self-esteem, look for the part of that religion that, as you mentioned, someone mentioned before about self-esteem, and establish a firm sense of self-esteem. Someone mentioned that we're trapped very much in Eurocentric visions of religion. That's true. But usually people who are trapped, non-European peoples who are trapped in Eurocentric interpretations of religion probably haven't really gone to the source of the material. People seem to have, take Christianity, people seem to have conveniently forgotten that the early years of Christianity were not spent in Rome, and they were not spent in Greece. They were spent in Africa. The earliest priests were African. And if that's not enough, read the Bible. Read Revelations. Read the only description of what Jesus Christ looked like. He had apparently skin the color of bronze and hair like sheepskin. Now that's not a blonde person with blue eyes. So just read the Bible. It's right there in the middle. You know? Liberation is often in the belly of the beast. It's right there.
I'm being stopped.
My brother, thank you, and we look forward to having you again.
Thank you for letting me come and speak to you tonight. I enjoyed it.